For 70 years, the prevalence of state-on-state kinetic warfare has steadily declined, but the pursuit of absolute political power has not. It's simply relocated. States and populations now assert dominance and wage conflict without resorting to overt physical violence. This is the domain of political warfare. To understand how this works, we have to look at two radically different theorists. The first is Gene Sharp, widely considered the Clausewitz of nonviolent warfare. Sharp spent his life engineering the architecture of bottom-up regime collapse. Building on the philosophy and moral power demonstrated by figures like Mahatma Gandhi, Sharp codified the exact mechanics of how unarmed civilians dismantle dictatorships. On the exact opposite end of the spectrum is Valery Gerasimov, chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces. Gerasimov is the primary doctrinal figure behind a modern, state-sponsored apparatus designed to subvert and dismantle target nations from the outside in. Using state resources to engineer political outcomes is not a new concept. During the early days of the Cold War, diplomat George Kennan defined political warfare as the employment of all means at a nation's command, short of war, to achieve its national objectives. When we map Sharp's theories of civilian resistance directly against Russia's offensive doctrine, a striking alignment emerges. Both operate on the exact same socio-political mechanism, the manipulation of societal consent. Sharp's framework begins by rejecting the monolith theory of power. This is the assumption that a state's authority is a fixed, self-reinforcing absolute that can only be countered with equal physical force. He argued instead for the pluralistic dependency theory. Here, political power is derived from the voluntary consent of the citizenry, resting on 5 structural pillars. The first two are the voluntary acceptance of the ruler's authority and the skills the population provides. The next two rely on ideology, a society's tolerance for obedience, and material resources, encompassing the regime's control over wealth and physical infrastructure. The final pillar is sanctions, the enforcement mechanisms a government uses against its own citizens. To dismantle these pillars, Sharp cataloged 198 specific methods of nonviolent action. These are not expressions of passive pacifism. They are calculated, weaponized acts of omission, refusing to do what is expected, and commission, doing what is forbidden. Tactics like mass strikes directly sever the material resources pillar. Without money and labor, infrastructure freezes. Simultaneously, methods of political non-cooperation, like security forces committing mutiny, fracture the authority and sanctions pillars. With enforcement mechanisms gone, the state node collapses. When the state attempts to regain control through force, resistance movements can employ what Sharp called political jujitsu. Violent repression directed at strictly nonviolent actors creates a stark contrast that delegitimizes the regime. The state's own violent weight is redirected to shatter its remaining ideological pillars, turning neutral parties and international observers against the rulers. Unarmed populations routinely collapse heavily armed regimes by systematically withdrawing the structural consent those regimes require to operate. This bottom-up theory of liberation has a top-down mirror. It is formalized in the Russian strategy known as New Generation Warfare, or the Gerasimov model. This timeline maps the Gerasimov model. The strategy achieves strategic objectives beneath a flat line, the threshold of conventional military response. Phase 1 is covert generation. Over decades, Russian intelligence built proxy networks and infiltrated the target state's social architecture. The strategy then moves into Phase 2, exacerbation. The aggressor uses targeted information warfare and economic pressure to artificially manufacture a crisis of consent, mobilizing populations into massive street protests to destabilize the existing government. This sharp spike on the timeline represents phases 3 through 5, covering the 2014 annexation of Crimea. The conflict actions escalate rapidly, but explicitly stop just millimeters below the kinetic war threshold. The tactical reality of this threshold manipulation is executed by unmarked special operations forces, often called Little Green Men. They seize critical infrastructure and local government buildings without triggering an international military retaliation. Simultaneously, this model was deployed in the Donbass region, where armed proxies and conventional Russian units merged to create a protracted hybrid conflict designed to bleed Ukrainian resources. The final phase is normalization. The aggressor state halts overt hostilities, establishing a new status quo and enforcing a manufactured peace on its own terms. The strategic intersection here is critical. Russia's doctrine effectively weaponizes Gene Sharp's methods. By funding proxy groups and staging protests, the Kremlin engineers an artificial top-down withdrawal of consent to break the target state from within. What the Western public perceived as spontaneous, abrupt geopolitical crises in 2014 were actually the calculated, culminating phases of a decades-long political warfare campaign. Sharp's Manual for Liberation and Gerasimov's Manual for Subversion target the exact same vulnerabilities. As the models overlap, the connection becomes clear. Gerasimov's offensive vectors of diplomatic, information, military, and economic warfare align perfectly to attack Sharp's defensive pillars of authority, ideology, and resources. Kinetic militaries are built to destroy physical infrastructure. Modern asymmetric power rests entirely on socio-political infrastructure. The battlefield is the human domain. This creates the defender's dilemma. Heavily armed nations remain highly vulnerable if their populations can be psychologically or economically severed from the state apparatus. To counter this vulnerability, Sharp proposed a policy solution called civilian-based defense. This concept shifts national security reliance away from purely outward-facing armed forces. Instead, it looks inward, building defense through the civic morale, institutional character, and social discipline of the populace itself. This aligns with modern strategic recommendations, such as those from the Naval Postgraduate School, which urge the adoption of a proactive U.S. political warfare strategy. By integrating special operations forces to build partner capacity, nations can fortify their societal resilience before the covert phases of subversion take root. Surviving the current geopolitical reality requires accepting that the ultimate battlefield is the consent of the governed. A nation cannot defend its borders with conventional weapons if it cannot defend the cognitive and societal pillars of the state.